Hello, and welcome to another session of The Game Mechanics. I'm super excited today to be talking about the entire audioscape of games because it's such an important emotional and feedback loop. Today, we have two guests with us. First, I'm going to start with Jon Everist. I've worked with many composers over the years. I've got to say my most rewarding experiences have been working with you on Shadowrun and BattleTech and even the work we got to do on Lamplighters League. Really loved all those sessions. Very excited that you could join us. And also we have Lucas. Lucas had worked a lot on environmental sound design and on UX design and some really cool augmented reality projects that we've done. And those parts are really important. So great to have you here as well. Lucas, thank you. So, first why don't we do quick introductions? Lucas, why don't you say a quick hello, and then we'll go on to Jon. He's older. He'll have more to say.
Hi, I'm Lucas. I have done some sound effects for videos and for an augmented reality app we were working on for like commerce, I guess.
Yeah, it was a really cool project we were working on with Walmart. And Jon, you got to video game composing not as like your first job. That was relatively late in your career, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say the privilege of my life has been working with you and seeing Harebrained Schemes grow and put out all these amazing games over the years. And I mean, really, my first big break was from you and Mitch on the Shadowrun return stuff, and then that segued into Shadowrun Hong Kong or Dragonfall, and then Hong Kong, and Necropolis all the way up through Lamplighters League. So yeah, and I made a career change relatively late, all things considered, into video game composing. I think I was about 26 when I went back to music school. Kind of had a dead-end job, had been making music my whole life, sort of doing it on the side, and had one of those little, moments in life where you're like, what am I doing? Do I have to do this forever? I don't want to be miserable forever. Let me, take the small amount of money I've funneled away into my retirement fund and be very fiscally irresponsible and drain that out, go back to school, and try my luck at doing composing for video games full time. And got very lucky. I think luckily crossed paths with people that ended up working with you and Mitch, Harebrained.
Yeah.
And
we were doing a class in art design. We were trying to remember who actually introduced you to us at Harebrained. We couldn't figure that out.
It was Jen Tran.
Oh, that's right. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we did a few student games together, and she was like the art director on those games because she was in the art program. And I think she ended up dropping out of school and getting recruited by you guys. And then through her, I sort of ended up dropping out of school too and starting the whole process. So yeah, Harebrained Schemes is fostering a whole cohort of college dropouts,
including the founders. So yeah.
Over some weird thing about Disney animators that they all start at Cal Arts and then drop out after their first year once they get a job at Disney.
Yeah, and more recently, you've been working on a Star Wars game. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I was a co-composer on Star Wars Outlaws, Ubisoft open world Star Wars game. Myself and my good friend, the primary composer, Will Roger, did that along with my other good friend, co-composer Kazuma Jinochi, who Kazuma did like Metal Gear Solid. He did Iron Man VR, Halo 5, I think it was his as well. Will, of course, is the composer for the smash success Helldivers 2, which he just won a BAFTA for. And we were nominated for Star Wars Outlaws at the BAFTAs and also at the Grammys, which was really cool. So yeah, it's been an awesome ride and sort of wild to think of where it all started with you guys way back, it's 12 years now or something like that.
Wow. Totally.
And then, yeah, crazy. But what a fun ride.
I follow you on social media, and it's always exciting for me. I live through your experiences. I'm like always super stoked to see you at awards, those and stuff like that.
Well, it's just because the guy looks good on tux. What can you say? And you have a beautiful wife on your arm. That never hurts.
Yeah.
But let's dive in, and maybe let's start with music since we've been talking primarily about music for games, and talk about kind of your approach for how you think about music in games versus like music in film or music in television, and the kind of emotional landscape you're trying to create with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Music with film and games is there's obvious differences, right? There's the linearity of film, which is, I think, the easiest thing to pick out as the difference there. But we also have to keep in mind that depending on the game, you also will have possibly hours of sort of filmic cutscene animations and cinematics as well. So like Star Wars Outlaws, I think we had something like 4 or 5 hours of cinematic cutscenes. So you have that element of traditional sort of film scoring and linearity there. And then you also have to balance that with this aspect of interactivity, sort of chance music and probabilistic music, which I find really interesting. I find it's one of the most inspiring things to me of the genre and sort of, and why I kind of got really interested in pursuing game scoring specifically. And it depends on the project, but like if we were to talk about the Star Wars Outlaws score, it's something that we really try to figure out very early. So this is also every game that I've done with Harebrained Schemes. Lamplighters League is a great example. You get in as early as possible, and for me, you're trying to fully understand the intentions and what the developers are reaching for as far as their like lofty goals of how we want this project to make people feel. What is sort of like the takeaway that these developers are trying to make the person feel when they're playing the game, and the emotional arc that they want to experience. And once we have those lofty goals and we've seen the concept art and read sort of the story and the background and the lore and stuff, which Harebrained Schemes has been amazing at doing, and I think you sort of have a pedigree of creating these incredibly dense and lore-filled worlds that are extremely inspiring for composers to read through, because that is sort of like, we want to live in the world that we're writing music for to a certain extent. Once you have those lofty goals of where the dev is sort of aiming for, you sort of have to get in the weeds after that and decide, okay, now that I know how they want people to feel, what's the mechanics that's going to be propping up this sort of system? And that's where, as a composer, you sort of have to understand a lot about game development pretty specifically, and also just generally how games are constructed and how most games are constructed on a set of pillars that are sort of unchangeable throughout the process. There's sort of these game development, like, bastions of like, this is what the game at the most fundamental level is, point A to point B, collect XYZ and bring back to point A or whatever like that. It's sort of like dumbing it down after you've like got the lofty goals of the developer, dumbing it down to its simplest form and deciding like, what can the music system, attach itself to that won't change throughout the whole process. And that's really inspiring too, because you have to understand the fundamental levels of these games. And then from that, you build a music system on top of it that will essentially inform every piece of music you write, how you record the project, how you export the project, how you import all the music into the project. It's sort of, to me, it's the most important thing, is understanding a music system as early as possible, because it really can affect absolutely everything.
Do you visualize that with like a flow chart for how you're thinking about how a music system will work in a game? That's an interesting concept to me.
Yeah, I think there's lots of different ways to do it. Like oftentimes it's flow charts, or just like, having a whiteboard somewhere in the studio and kind of writing out conceptually what the game looks like at that moment, if it's just a prototype, and deciding like where to basically build the musical foundation. Because just like game development, it's always changing. Things are sort of getting pulled back and stripped down. Maybe the music system has to be able to still stand on this foundation while being able to be built out as much as possible, and maybe stripped down as well as the game development cycle changes. So yeah, it's usually start with like the very simple, like, with Lamplighters League, it was like infiltration, or I think they called it quiet mode infiltration, and then loud mode combat. And, it sounds very simple, but then on those two sort of pillars, you have two big chunks of music. You need transitions between those two chunks. And if you have, 8 different locations with maybe day and night cycles. That's, 16 different locations, basically. You can extrapolate exactly how much major pieces of music you're going to need in a game. And then you need to decide, okay, is the budget enough where we can cover that with unique music through the whole project? And then you have to go, okay, what can we afford to reuse in certain places? Maybe we can take recordings that we did for this one area and find a way to reconstruct that into a different type of different piece of music in another area. So yeah, you're kind of like, you have this kind of master system that you're working with, and you're obviously, your goal is like, we will use every ounce of budget we can possibly use to cover the music as much as possible. But ultimately, you're sort of making this deal with yourself of what is the most important thing to focus on. And then based on the way you're recording, if you're recording live, you can reuse a lot of stuff to make other pieces of music. Like, for example, in Lamplighters League, we have so many good live recordings for the Hideout theme that plays. It's one of the most played songs, I think, in the game. That piece is actually an amalgam of, I think, 5 different pieces of music that we recorded live, cut together and sort of reorchestrated in a way that makes it sound like it's a brand new piece. But really, it's just a reuse from other pieces of music that we recorded.
One of the things you touched on was as the pace or energy of a scene changes, right? You go from a planning, which could be very thoughtful, kind of, melody and slower pace as you're planning. And then you go into combat, right? And the pace picks up and the energy picks up. Ideally, that sounds like a smooth transition. Ideally, the audience, the player doesn't notice, oh, one piece of music ended, another piece of music began. But that means you have to kind of write all these kind of, well, if to use an animation a system approach, right? You would have an idle. You cycle through the idle so that from the idle you can go into any other animation, right? Is that a similar kind of concept in music? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that it can't be like an idle in animation where it's like it has no information in it or limited information. It has to be a transition piece of music that has like, well, I don't know, I think we should talk about things in a way that someone who has very little knowledge of music theory can understand too. But basically, in music, there's rhythm, harmony, and melody, and the tempo. If the tempo actually changes between the two pieces of music, there needs to be a transition in tempo in that transition piece, right? And then if there's chord, like if the piece of music has harmony, the harmony has to, if it's in one key in one piece of music and in a different key in the other piece, then maybe there's a transition in terms of harmony in that segment as well.
Exactly. And this kind of goes back to the idea of what I have this term called minimal viable interactivity. And when I'm creating a project or a music system, I design it in a way where I would be able to ship the game with the music system in the most simplest state possible and still have it sort of be passable as a music system. So for transitions is a great example, because if you set up a game music project and you think like, okay, I'm going to change keys every 4 bars, and if I exit on anywhere in the piece of music, I want a transition segment that is in the relative key, in the right key, or takes the piece into a key transition that makes musical sense and then goes into the next track. You're talking about possibly hundreds of transition segments that you have to write and sort of take into account, right? And lots of games do that. And I think if you can do it, you really should. But this is sort of the classic sort of game development thing, is you have to focus your attention on what is going to be the most impact and make the most sense with the budget that you have. So you have to sort of make a call pretty early of like, okay, like, are we going to really simplify this? And we're going to write all combat tracks in one key. And so we know we can transition out of it in a very simple way. And maybe you say, well, okay, maybe we could do that, but maybe also in one location, like if there's a location that's in I mean, for Star Wars, as an example, we had planet locations. So are we going to make all planet locations a similar key? And there's also, like in music theory, there are certain keys that sort of work really well together that you can transition easily in and out of with relative keys and stuff like that. And then there's also things like faction music in Star Wars as an example. The faction music could all be in similar or related keys. Combat music could be in similar or related tempos. This is sort of how you have to think as a composer of like, what is going to be the most elegant system that meets all these budget and criteria restrictions that you have. Because if, I think it's like a rule in any type of music, if everything is permitted, then you don't get anything done, right? It's like you have to sort of set up a tempo. You have to set a tempo. You have to set a key. You have to, choose your instrumentation. Sort of these constraints that you set and end up allowing you to be extremely creative. Because, like you said, if everything's going to be in D, for example, or D minor, you have to be really creative and write creatively to not make it boring, right? Or to make the transitions exciting. But obviously our goal is to make everything as seamless as possible. So that's the main goal. So as far as we can get with the budget we have is definitely the goal there.
And these are themes we've been hitting on through all of these master classes, the concepts of minimum viable, right? What boil your design down to absolutely the smallest it can be. Think about that constraints, budget, time, skills you have available, talents you have available, tools you have available, right? All those constraints actually are tools for creativity rather than things you should be, railing against and pissed off about, right? Take those as you're given, as your launching pad. And how do I then, be creative within the constraints I've got? So no matter what form of art, and there's so many forms of art that go into a video game, but all of them, I think, have that same recurring message, right? Figure out how to make gold out of the hay you've got.
Absolutely.
So in musical theater, right, there's, a form of musical theater called jukebox shows, right? Where there was no original music composed for the show, right? As opposed to Sondheim or an Andrew Lloyd Webber, right? They will have taken all the music of an artist or mixed music of a genre together to pull together a score, but without original composition. Likely, most of our beginning game designers, right? People aren't going to have the ability to score, original music for their games. So would love your guys' thoughts on, if you're going and getting music from existing sources, right? Buying them from music packs, buying them, licensing music where available, and how to think about assembling a score from existing pieces of music.
Like you said, it's sort of goes into that creative constraint sort of idea because, as someone who, before I went back to school and studied classical composition and sort of working with like, orchestras, I still, obviously I use a lot of hybrid technology of live musicians and synths and synthetic instrumentation, software synths and stuff like that. But I used to make music sampling, like I was producing like hip hop and electronic music and sampling from records and stuff like that. And, I think it's a similar sort of concept. You're sort of, you have to be attuned, your ear has to be attuned creatively into what is the feeling and the vibe that you're going for in a piece of music. And, I think part of the artistry is sort of like trusting your gut and your intuition. If something sounds interesting to you creatively, pulling it into the project to test it out. I hear a lot of developers, even the devs that I work with now, saying like, I have no musical inclinations or background at all, and I don't really feel comfortable speaking about music quality or whatever. And oddly enough, those are usually the people that have the best insight into the music that you deliver, because they seem to think that the feeling of music is not the knowing of music, but the feeling of music is more important than the knowledge of the theory and stuff like that. So, I think there's just certain considerations of just first understanding what you like and understanding how you want the game to sound based on touchstones for you of games that you really like, and sort of going down that route and maybe doing an A and B comparison along the way of like, is this is this game sort of musically hitting these interesting notes that make me like this other game and whatnot. And there's a lot of considerations for that beyond just music too. There's things like mixing, which I think is extremely important for video games. You have to really keep a close eye on your sound levels and sort of understanding what is the proper mix between music and sound effects and dialogue. And I think, for music mixing, one of the greatest tools we have is A and B comparison with tracks. So still to this day, when I'm mixing a piece of music, we've just recorded it live and we're putting it back together, I still will take a reference track of a piece of music I really like, and I will listen to mine and then switch over to theirs, and I'll be able to gauge, like, is this a good enough level where if I were to hear this in a film or in a game, it wouldn't stand out to me as being like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Like something sounds strange there. So I think that's an important thing to do, is kind of, you can tune your ears over time. If you feel uncomfortable with this process, you can tune your ears over time just by A and Bing stuff a lot.
This episode of The Game Mechanics was brought to you by Adventure Forge, an all-in-one toolkit for crafting story-rich games for the PC and Mac. Create branching narratives, asymmetric RPGs, puzzle games, and much more. No coding required, no syntax, just smart logic written in plain English. You don't need permission, you don't need credentials, you just need a story, a spark, a reason. Build the game only you can make.
One thing that I've suggested to students sometimes, which has been somewhat helpful, is it's very common to listen to music when you're working, when you're creating something. And so I've asked people to kind of create a music diary of what they were listening to when they were making different scenes, different parts, different characters, so on. And then that could become a good kind of starting point to look for music that makes you probably can't afford the music that you were listening to from famous people, but those become kind of good touchstones to say, oh, I want to look for a piece of music that feels like this, because that's clearly was inspiring me when I was making this level, when I was making this character or dealing with this part of the story. So things like that, because I'm one of those completely music illiterate people, but it's like the worst kind of people who buy art. Just like, I don't know art, but I know what I like. So, being able to at least point to things that inspired you can really help you, or, find existing music or compose original music.
Yeah, John, do you know of any good marketplaces for royalty-free music or music that can be licensed by game creators who aren't planning on writing their own music for games?
One of the tools that I am familiar with that I do use sometimes is a program called Splice.
Oh, yeah.
And you pay a subscription for it, but you have access to, tons of libraries of sometimes they're loops, sometimes they're plugins, sometimes they're people singing and stuff like that. And I've used it mainly for if I'm creating an electronic piece of music and I am oh, I need a didgeridoo sound or whatever, something strange that I can use and process in the synths and whatnot. And there's surprisingly a lot of interesting stuff there. And you can sort of this gets more into music production because you are still combining things together and hopefully blending it with other elements as well. Because I don't know if their license agreement allows you to use them completely isolated, but I could be wrong about that. Anyways, but yeah, that's something I've used often.
Yeah, I was thinking if a lot of people watching this probably have used something like GarageBand, where there are loops that already exist and you just drag them and place them in a timeline and you can layer them however you want. And something like Splice allows you to put in a tempo. So in music, a tempo is usually measured in beats per minute. So that's how fast the song feels. So if you know this is going to be a fast scene in the game, you could put into Splice 140 BPM or something, and then see all these loops that would be at the same tempo. And then it also allows you to search for a key. So even if you don't know anything about music, just making sure that the loops have the same key will help you find ones that will fit together. And that could be a good way to start, maybe both learn about making music, but also quickly put together something for no budget game.
You touched on location music, and for me, that always creates an interesting kind of, to the mix question, kind of competition between ambient sound effects of a location and the music of a location, right? First, let's talk a little bit about crafting the ambient sounds of a location. Lucas, do you want to talk about that a little bit? And then we can talk about how the two potentially compete or work together.
So I think with sound effects broadly, there's diegetic sounds, which are ones that it's like in the environment of the character. So that could be like if they're in like the woods, maybe there's some like birds chirping and maybe a sound of wind through the leaves, and that could be those could be looping sounds that are diegetic, meaning that they just go on forever. And then there's also game sounds that are going to be triggered by the characters, like footsteps on different materials. So if they're walking on grass, it'll be like sounds of footsteps in grass, whereas on gravel it'll be different. So that could make it a lot more immersive to have different kinds of footsteps, especially in a game that's like a first person perspective game where you don't see their feet. It could help be immersive to have sounds of different materials that they're walking on. And then of course there's gonna be the sounds of like actual like attacks and combat, like swords and armor and spells. And spells are a fun one because they get into a lot of more abstract kind of sound design kind of territory. And that could mean like if it's an ice spell, like recording things that are actual ice, or also things that like just kind of emotionally evoke ice, like chimes or things like that, and combining them.
I think I want to build on what you were saying a little bit about environmental sound and the diegetic nature of that versus kind of interactive sound, right? So because in some respect, right, the sound designer is a control of the environmental sound, right? The birds, the wind, the factory, the machines, those are constant that are in your control. And they don't necessarily need to be constant, right? They can be like a machine can be turning on and turning off, and those can be kind of tangentially related to the player's doing, but they're not underneath players' direct control, right? Versus the footsteps, the sword clashing, a bullet being fired, those are directly underneath player control. So you don't have any control of the timing of those, right? You have to be your effects and everything have to be ready to be instantly mixed based upon the players and the action player.
That's kind of a difference between like a loop, and then the opposite of a loop in audio stuff is a one shot. So like a one shot is something that's just meant to be played, like kind of like playing a key on a keyboard. Like when you press it, it makes this thing happen when that happens. And I think, that's exactly how those things are implemented. But something about sound effects that I learned over time with doing them is you kind of have to think about what is going to be playing at the same time. Because if you have like all of your sound effects and they're all like really huge sounding because they sounded really nice in isolation being huge, they might take up like the whole frequency spectrum. And when things are in kind of a similar range, it can be hard to differentiate between what's going on there. And so like if you're gonna have some like rustling leaves in your environment sound, and then you got the crunchy like grass sound, like those could be potentially in similar places in the audio spectrum, and it could be hard to differentiate between certain things. So like kind of thinking about how sounds are going to go together can be helpful for making a mix that doesn't sound cluttered.
Do you actually kind of reserve parts of the spectrum, like the FCC has to reserve parts of the spectrum for different radio waves to come across, or
kind of? Yeah. I think that's a good way to think about it. If you're going to get hit in the chest, like the most important thing there is going to be like the bass hit it. You know what I mean? Like, so you want to make sure that part is in there. And then maybe you want some upper frequencies that have like kind of the air of getting hit. But there might be some stuff in the middle that is less important for that sound. So it's kind of with each sound identifying what is important, what the sound is, and then making sure that no superfluous information is in there, because that could be used in other places in the mix.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to, like you said, to be able to identify those things. The last part of the kind of competition for the year is UI sound effects, right?
Yeah.
Pushing of a button, the sliding of something.
But that's actually a non-diegetic sound. So that's I was going to get to the sounds that like the player hears, but the characters in the game don't hear. Well, oftentimes those sounds can be musical. Actually, they can have an actual pitch to them, and I think when you're doing stuff like that, it can be really fun to consider what music is playing at the time of the sound effects and making sure that those sounds are in a related key.
I'm going to use a phrase that we think about mostly in terms of writing, but I think is very true in terms of sound design as well, which is the theater of the mind. So you can use words to inspire incredible imagery or emotions in people's mind, even though, literally just black and white text on the screen. I think music and sound effects have a similar kind of concept, because they tell stories that are composed and assembled in the head. For me, at my generation, right, the piece of music that every kid learned that on was Peter and the Wolf, right? The idea of being able to tell a story through music, and you could actually follow the themes of the characters, and you didn't. And then of course Star Wars was like hit you over the head with the themes, right? Here they are, and again, but they were super useful. And so you've got that kind of storytelling through music. And then when you get into sound effect design and environmental design, as you mentioned, Lucas, they're completely not linear, right? I mean, they're not realistic. They're emotional, right? Mm-hmm. Like the roar, like, the famous turning on a lightsaber has a huge roar of a lion in it, right? Mm-hmm. Has all these other kind of layered things to build up that sound signature. And some of those sounds trigger things even that you don't really recognize it, right? But they're triggering emotions in you. I'd love both of you to talk a little bit about that kind of emotional design of soundscape, both on the music side and the sound effect side. Jon, why don't you go ahead and start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, I think especially in recent years, there's been really, we call it in composition a signature sound for pieces of music. And it was sort of a touchstone for us in Star Wars Outlaws, especially, but even for a score like Lamplighters, which you would think of is Lamplighters is sort of like a classic orchestral score from like the 90s, early 2000s action movies sort of vibe. But still, there is something in music composition where you are sort of grabbing the attention, like you said, with a theater of the mind of someone who's listening, with some sort of interesting authorship over whether it's an instrument or a synth or an instrumentation or a pad or something like that. We're always trying to grasp for some sort of signature quality in a piece of music that will pique somebody's interest. I think a good example, I just did a piece of music where I don't have it close by, but I have an old classical guitar, a nylon string guitar, and I set it up with some tinfoil around the bridge of it. And I have this small bow, like for bowing a violin. It allows you to place it in between the strings, and you can bow these strings, and it sort of makes this resonant noise. And with the aluminum foil underneath the bridge, it added this sort of like gritty, weird quality to it. And when I recorded it, you hear it, and that your brain is sort of like, that sounds like it could be a viola or something. It sounds like a viola, but it sounds sort of like otherworldly because you're also processing it with effects plugins and reverb and stuff. And adding that on top of like sort of traditional musical elements like orchestra and whatnot, the brain still like picks that out and is like, something is weird about this, in a way that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, because it has this quality in the mix that is like grabbing you or whatever. So that's like one of the most difficult things to establish in a score. Writing melodies takes a long time as well, but dialing in a really interesting sound quality for some sort of major theme is incredibly difficult to do. And I think a simple example of that for Star Wars, the main theme that was written by Will Roget, is played on an electric violin that is processed in a really interesting way. So it sounds violin-like, but it has this really strange quality to it that when I hear it, I don't think electric violin, because I've heard a lot of electric violins and they usually sound terrible to me, to be honest. But I hear it, I'm like, whoa, that sounds like some sort of Middle Eastern bowed instrument that is played in a very evocative way. But really, it was just Will bashing around ideas of what made this theme stand out with this interesting sound quality to it. So yeah, it's a big thing in music.
When I was talking about elements of music, I mentioned rhythm and harmony and melody, but timbre, which is like, how is it soft sounding or is it harsh sounding? Is it like a brass instrument playing as its loudest volume, or is it a recorder playing out of tune in middle school? Those things have a huge emotional impact on the sound, even if they're playing the same melody. Like if you play a melody with a very pure kind of sine wave sound, it'll have a really mellow quality to it. Or if you make it a square wave sound, it'll have more of a brassiness to it.
When you think about building up sounds from non-literal things, what are some of your favorite examples of weird things that you've built in sounds to get emotional responses?
I've used slime a lot for gore sounds, like when you make slime with borax and Elmer's glue like you do as a kid. It is great for making like gore and squishy sounds.
Yeah, it is. There is a certain amount of Foley, right? The old film Foley kind of
Absolutely.
work.
For sound design. Yeah, for sure.
Right. So, crunching bones and celery cracking and, all these kind of things, which non-literal, but evoke the right emotional response. Right. And now with the tools we've got in terms of layering things on, right? Like going out, this is 40 years, right? An embarrassingly long time, like 50 some odd years ago for Star Wars, going out and hitting high tension wires with a hammer and then combining that with a lion's roar and combining that with, the sound of a, blender, turning on to form into a blaster or a lightsaber, so on. So yeah, it can get quite diverse and really interesting.
Yeah, I feel all those techniques are still super usable now with sampling. Like it's still like finding a physical object that's making an interesting sound will often have a more unique timbre than something that's just generated with a synthesizer alone. I mean, I think synthesizers are awesome, but having something that has, because in the real world, sounds don't just have a tone, they have like white noise and other harmonics that aren't expected. And sometimes those things can add a lot of character to a sound.
We've got all these different types of sound. We've got our music, we've got our ambient sounds, our diegetic sounds, our game sounds, our interface sounds. And you put all those in my hand and what you get is a mess. You keep adding colors and all you get is brown. Right? How can we give guidance about trying to direct the ear like we do visually trying to direct the eye?
This is the most important part, I think, of the process, in my opinion. And it's also the part that I am the least qualified probably to answer. A lot of times I'm delivering music and then I'm sort of like, not my problem anymore to a certain extent. But, I think there's still a lot to be said about as a game designer or as someone who's going to be in charge of audio for a game. It's a good idea to really, have listening sessions where you're listening to really games that you really like and sort of writing down things that really stand out to you. And in certain moments, what is in the forefront, what's in the background, and that sort of thing. There's so many different ways to do this mixing part, depending on obviously like budget and what you're working with. If you're really just working on a small solo game where you're trying to do the best that you can, I think there's some tools and sort of rules that you can think about. I really like to think of not only the spectrum of sound in represented by frequency, by hertz, but also the spatial aspect of sound in terms of stereo sound, obviously, but then also the possibility of controlling things like the center channel of sound in certain instances. Like a really complex game that we talked about this a lot, but the Star Wars game, very complex mixing. I think it's one of the best mixed games I've ever heard, and they have a team of probably 5 people that are full-time just doing that sort of thing, and it's doing mixed priority. It's deciding like dialogue is in the center channel oftentimes. They do a lot of dynamic mixing, so like depending on what's happening, spoken dialogue will be highest priority usually all the time. And then when combat starts, they will actually deprioritize some of that for a small amount of time and increase the priority of sound effects really, really high and music really, really high as much as they can get away with, and then slowly taper down sound effects actually and keep music very, very high to keep the sort of element of excitement going. And then I think they even have rules where like explosions and stuff will prioritize obviously really high. But I think in general, like depending on the game that you're making, if you're making a game that's very narrative driven, you want to make sure dialogue is clear and really able to be understood. A lot of times that means like focusing it in the center channel, like even in mono. And then for music, if you can get away with doing some dynamic mixing, that can be a good idea. But the thing you want to be aware of is you don't want music to be constantly going up and down, up and down, up and down. You want it to be sort of as natural and filmic sounding as possible. So, a lot of this is coordinating with who is doing what and making sure that you kind of set up some rules maybe early on about loudness levels of music and loudness levels of dialogue that's being delivered. There's sort of standards out there already for film and TV. They call it the LUF standard, the LUF standard. And so it might be worth taking a look at that. But I think, if your time is really precious and you're kind of just trying to make a game and you're not looking to go, win a BAFTA or something like that for audio mixing, I think just listening to games and trying to understand like what makes them sound, what makes the games that you enjoy sound good. And even though I've heard Jordan say this a few times about if he's in charge, everything would be brown noise, but there's no way that's possible, because I think Jordan has a really clear understanding of an aesthetic of a game. And I think you'd be surprised if you really were to like look in and dial things a little bit and sort of like, the reason why is because you love games and intuitively know when something is sounding right and not. And there's nothing wrong with making a few mistakes here and there along the way, because you just will get better every time.
You can't be afraid of mistakes, otherwise you don't make anything. I do think that building rules for yourself helps to establish those constraints. It helps you make those decisions. Lucas, you've not had 5% editing teams or leveling teams on the more humble projects you've worked on. So any guidance for kind of smaller scale?
A huge thing that can help a mix is thinking like you don't always need to have sound effects, music, and dialogue at the same time. Like you could prioritize one aspect of the soundscape during a part of the game, and maybe there's a part of the game like in a menu like where it's mostly just UI sounds and music. For emotional effects, maybe there's no sound effects for a little bit and you just hear music. There's nothing that says you have to always have every kind of sound happening at the same time.
If you view it as three, right, music, sound effects, and UI/player sounds, it's kind of like the old sign in garages, right? One is cheap, two is hard, three is even harder. But you can pick your battles. As you said, you can be more selective in that way.
I kind of think about it like music composition in a lot of ways. When you're writing an arrangement, you want to prioritize something, so you'll deprioritize other things so that thing that's important at that time can shine. In painting, you've got a foreground, a midground, and a background, right? And the background is going to be quieter than the foreground. And if the foreground's a certain color, then you want the background to be a color that complements that color. That's a good metaphor for mixing, thinking about the foreground, the midground, and the background.
As both of you mentioned, the power of silence too, right? Without silence, there's no noise, there's no music. So being able to use silence or lack of a certain part of the soundscape is also a powerful tool. And a good segue to the silence we're about to have as we wrap up. So let's go to closing comments and thoughts for new game creators to send them on. Why don't we start with Lucas and then we'll end with John.
Don't be afraid to experiment and look into Splice and try combining different loops. Start experimenting with music composition and seeing how that can enhance your games.
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit of the same. Just try to have fun and don't get tripped up by thinking that there's one right way to do something. I do things the wrong way every day, and doing things that sound interesting to me always leads me to interesting destinations, even if it's an accident. Like just the other day, I was working on a synth thing for a project, and I had the intention of making like a bass line or something. I can't even remember what it was. and I basically routed my signal into the incorrect spot and created a sort of feedback loop that sounded incredibly interesting to me. And that took me on like a 2-hour side quest of making this really interesting ambience that I'm going to end up using in the game. And, I think it's important to know the rules so that you can break them. But if you're just starting out, just focus on having fun and constantly sort of creating, and you're going to get there eventually. Nobody sits down at the piano the first day and is a virtuoso. It takes time and it takes practice, and your ear will get better and your game will sound better each time you go in there.
Whenever I'm teaching music to a student, I always remember it's called playing music, because it's supposed to be fun.
We're here making games because we're passionate about it. And so there should always be joy connected to the creation of it. I always say the audience, the players can tell if you were smiling when you make it. And there is no such thing as perfect, right? Especially if you've been in the business forever, like I am. I make new mistakes every day. I unfortunately repeat mistakes every day from my previous years. And that's all part of the process. And so I love both those messages. And I love having both of you here. Thank you. This has been a fantastic session. Really appreciate you spending the time with us. And hope to talk to both of you soon. Take care.
Sounds great. Thanks.